There is a chamber in the Egyptian desert that has been quietly filling with water for more than a century, and nobody has ever fully explained why it exists. It sits below ground level, behind one of the most celebrated temples in the country, and every time archaeologists try to study it properly, the water wins. Massive pillars of solid granite rise straight out of a flooded floor. Some of those blocks weigh close to 100 tons. There is no mortar anywhere in the structure. Not a trace of it, and the stone is joined so precisely that generations of researchers have failed to slide even a piece of paper into the seams. This is the Osireion, and while Egypt is full of ruins that fit neatly into the timeline we've been taught, this one refuses to behave. To understand why the Osireion causes so much trouble, you first need to understand where it's sitting. The site is called Abydos, on the west bank of the Nile in southern Egypt, and for thousands of years it was considered the holiest ground in the entire civilization. It was here, around 1280 BCE, that the pharaoh Seti I built a temple so refined that it's still regarded as one of the finest examples of New Kingdom art and architecture. Wall after wall of painted relief, a king list carved into stone that historians still rely on today. But walk behind that temple, past the rear wall, and the ground drops away into a lower depression. Sitting in that depression is the Osireion. And the first strange detail is architectural. Seti's builders didn't build over this space. They built around it. The rear of the temple bends outward in an unusual asymmetrical way, almost as if the builders were navigating around something that was already there and could not be moved or ignored. Why would a pharaoh's construction crew route an entire temple around a hole in the ground? Because of what Abydos meant to the Egyptians. According to their mythology, this was the burial place of Osiris himself, the god of the afterlife, whose body, according to legend, had been dismembered and scattered across Egypt after his murder. Abydos was believed to hold his head, or in some versions his entire body, and that made this patch of desert the emotional and religious center of the entire Egyptian concept of death and resurrection. Pilgrims traveled here for millennia. Kings wanted to be buried near it, or at least commemorated near it, because proximity to Osiris's resting place was thought to guarantee a better outcome in the next life. This wasn't a myth confined to storytelling. It shaped how an entire civilization treated a stretch of riverside desert as sacred beyond question. And the ground had a violent history to match the reverence. Not far from Seti's temple, archaeologists uncovered the tomb of a first dynasty king named Ur, one of Egypt's earliest rulers, dating back roughly 5,000 years. Surrounding his burial were hundreds of subsidiary graves. Attendants, servants, and household members buried in a single episode, seemingly to accompany the king into death. Early Egypt, in its formative centuries, appears to have practiced retainer sacrifice on a scale that later periods abandoned entirely. Whatever the Osireion turned out to be, it was built on ground that Egyptians had already treated as saturated with death and divine power for thousands of years before Seti ever laid a single stone. The modern discovery of the Osireion happened in 1902, when archaeologist Margaret Murray, working as part of a team under Flinders Petrie for the Egypt Exploration Fund, began excavating the depression behind Seti's temple. What her team found stunned them. A long descending passage led down into darkness, and the deeper they went, the more the excavation became a fight against rising groundwater. Eventually they reached a central hall supported by 10 enormous granite pillars, arranged in 2 parallel rows, holding up horizontal roofing blocks of staggering weight. Some of these blocks are estimated at close to 100 tons, heavier than the largest granite blocks found inside the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid, which weigh in the range of 50 to 80 tons each. And unlike almost every other structure from Seti's era, the Osireion had no decoration at all in its lowest, oldest core. No paint, no carved relief, nothing but severe, unornamented stone fitted with a level of precision that felt completely out of step with the flamboyant, richly decorated temple standing just meters away. That mismatch is the first thread that pulls the whole mystery loose. Seti I's temple is one of the most heavily inscribed and painted structures in Egypt. Every wall tells a story. Every column carries hieroglyphs planned into the design from the very beginning, because that's how Egyptian monumental building worked. The surfaces were prepared and smoothed specifically to receive inscriptions as part of the original construction process. The core of the Osireion breaks that rule entirely. Its walls were left bare, and where inscriptions do exist, they look added rather than planned, cut into surfaces that were never dressed to receive them, without the careful layout you'd expect from a royal workshop. It reads less like a monument built by a king who wanted his name remembered, and more like graffiti added to something that already existed. There's another detail that has bothered researchers for decades. When Egyptian kings dedicated a monument to a god, there was a nearly universal formula, an inscription declaring that the king built this as his monument for his divine father. That phrase, or something close to it, appears constantly across New Kingdom temples. It is conspicuously absent from the Osireion's core structure. Not damaged, not eroded, simply never there. And the entrance itself sits slightly outside the boundary of Seti's temple enclosure, an unusual placement if the king had truly conceived of the space as an organic part of his own building project. In 1933, the Egyptologist Henri Frankfurt proposed a solution that became the standard academic explanation for nearly a century. Seti deliberately designed the Osireion to look older than it was, as a symbolic architectural tribute to Osiris, essentially building a monument in an archaic style on purpose, the way a modern architect might design a building to evoke antiquity. This idea, often referred to as archaism, is a real and documented practice in Egyptian art history. Later periods did sometimes imitate older styles deliberately. But the explanation has a hole in it that rarely gets addressed directly. If Seti's workshop had the skill to produce something on this scale, using granite blocks heavier than anything else built during the entire New Kingdom, why does nothing else like it appear anywhere else in Egyptian architecture? Not before Seti, not after him, not anywhere in the centuries of building that followed. A technique this extraordinary, used exactly once and never again, is a strange kind of one-off for a civilization that normally repeated and refined its successful methods over and over. Margaret Murray, the same archaeologist who excavated the site in 1902 and went on to live to the age of 100, remaining professionally active into her 90s, never fully accepted that Seti had built the core structure. Her early instinct, formed while standing in that flooded chamber with her own hands on the stone, was that the Osireion predated him. That view was gradually set aside within mainstream Egyptology in favor of Frankfurt's archaism theory, not because new physical evidence disproved her, but because the newer explanation fit more comfortably into the existing timeline. If the core of the Osireion isn't Seti's original work, the obvious question is where else this exact building style shows up, and the answer takes us 300 miles north to Giza. Beside the Great Sphinx stands the Valley Temple, conventionally dated to the reign of Khafre, more than 1,000 years before Seti ever ruled. Stand the Valley Temple and the Osireion side by side, and the similarities are hard to dismiss. Both use massive stone blocks fitted without mortar. Both share the same severe, undecorated core. Both stand in stark contrast to the heavily ornamented architecture typical of their respective eras. The retaining walls around the Sphinx enclosure show the same Koran-cladding megalithic style. Three sites, separated by more than 1,000 years and hundreds of miles, all sharing an unusually specific and otherwise unrepeated construction tradition. The question of how ancient builders achieved this level of precision in granite, one of the hardest stones available to them, has been debated since the 19th century, when Flinders Petrie himself first documented drill holes and core samples from Egyptian quarries that showed remarkably fast, clean cutting. The mainstream explanation, still generally accepted, is that Egyptian workers used copper tools in combination with abrasive sand, along with enormous amounts of skilled, patient labor, to slowly grind and polish granite into shape, a process modern experiments have partially replicated but never fully matched at this scale and speed. Because that gap between demonstrated ancient tool capability and the finished precision of the stonework has never been completely closed, a smaller group of researchers and engineers, figures like Christopher Dunn among them, have argued that some of Egypt's most advanced stonework may reflect techniques or traditions that were later lost or forgotten, inherited from an earlier, poorly understood period rather than invented from scratch during the dynastic era itself. This view remains outside the mainstream consensus, and most Egyptologists reject it, but it persists because the underlying technical puzzle has never been fully resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Layered onto the stonework question is a separate, geological argument that has generated its own controversy. In 1992, Geologist Robert Schoch presented research to the Geological Society of America pointing to deep, undulating weathering patterns on the enclosure walls around the Sphinx. Patterns, he argued, were more consistent with prolonged heavy rainfall than with thousands of years of wind and sand erosion. Egypt's last sustained period of significant rainfall, part of what climatologists call the African humid period, ended roughly 5,000 years ago, earlier than the Sphinx's conventional dating. If Schoch's interpretation is correct, it would push the monument's origins back further than mainstream chronology allows. Schoch's theory has faced substantial pushback from geologists and Egyptologists alike, who argue flash flooding and other erosion mechanisms can produce similar patterns within the conventional timeline, and the debate remains unresolved and genuinely contested within the field, rather than settled in either direction. Writers like John Anthony West and later Graham Hancock popularized Schoch's findings for a broader audience, framing the Osireion, the Valley Temple, and the Sphinx enclosure as fragments of an older architectural tradition, a claim that remains firmly outside mainstream archaeology, but one that has proven difficult to fully dismiss given how little the core structures have actually been re-examined with modern tools since Frankfurt's 1933 proposal. Then there's the matter of scale, which is where the Osireion stops feeling merely mysterious and starts feeling genuinely uncanny. The doorways into the structure rise well over 12 feet, more than double the height needed for an ordinary human visitor, let alone the average Egyptian of the New Kingdom. The passageways are unusually wide for foot traffic, and the pillars themselves are taller and heavier than practical need would dictate even by the generous standards of temple architecture. Egyptian monuments were certainly built at symbolic scale on purpose. Grand facades were meant to overwhelm and awe, representing the power of the gods rather than human convenience. But that oversized treatment was typically reserved for the outward-facing, public parts of a temple. The private working spaces, the areas priests actually moved through day to day, were usually scaled close to normal human proportions. In the Osireion, even the interior passageways, spaces with no crowd to impress, remain oversized. And despite being framed by later tradition as a funerary monument to the god of the dead, no human remains have ever been recovered from inside it. No body, no burial goods confirming an occupant, nothing physically tying it to a specific person or a specific ritual purpose beyond its name. The site's odd reputation didn't start with modern archaeology either. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, more than 1,000 years after Seti I's reign had ended, described a fountain-like structure at Abydos that closely matches the Osireion's location and character, and notably did not credit Seti as its builder. To Strabo, writing over a millennium after the fact, this was already an old and enigmatic feature of the landscape, not a straightforward royal monument with a known and celebrated founder. That means people were treating this space as ancient and mysterious 1,000 years before archaeologists ever excavated it. And it remains just as unresolved 2,000 years after Strabo wrote about it. Today, the mystery is quite literally disappearing. Since the completion of the Aswan High Dam in the 1970s, groundwater levels throughout the region have risen substantially, pushing even more water into a chamber that was already partially flooded when Murray first excavated it. Researchers attempting to study the lowest, oldest sections of the Osireion now have to work through murky, rising water that obscures surfaces and makes close inspection difficult or impossible. There is a bitter irony in that. A modern engineering project built to control the Nile may be slowly erasing the physical evidence needed to finally settle a debate about ancient engineering that predates it by thousands of years. So the Osireion sits exactly where it has sat for millennia. Half submerged, silent, its granite pillars still holding weight that modern engineers would treat with genuine respect. Whether it truly is, as most Egyptologists maintain, an unusually ambitious archaeizing project built under Seti I to honor Osiris, or whether it represents something older that Seti's builders inherited, repurposed, and inscribed their names onto, remains a live and unsettled question. The mainstream explanation is plausible and well argued, but it hasn't been seriously retested with modern archaeological methods in nearly a century, and the physical evidence that could resolve the debate is quietly being swallowed by rising water every year. Until someone drains that chamber and studies it properly, the Osireion will keep doing what it has done for over 2,000 years. Standing there, refusing to explain itself, daring the next generation to figure out who really built it.